William Montgomery froze mid-stride on the cobblestone path, his $3,000 Armani suit suddenly feeling suffocating in the October heat. His daughter Bella sat cross-legged beneath the ancient oak tree, but she wasn't alone. A barefoot girl in a torn dress, held together by safety pins, was teaching his 11-year-old advanced calculus, equations that had stumped Bella's $200 per hour Harvard tutor just yesterday. His security detail tensed behind him, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons. The homeless child's voice carried clearly across Piedmont Park. "See, Miss Bella, when you integrate this function, you're finding the area under the curve of possibility." Will's chest tightened as he watched his daughter's face light up with understanding for the first time in months. Since Rebecca's death, Bella had been drowning academically, emotionally unreachable despite every expensive intervention he'd thrown at her grief. "Sir, should we intervene?" his head of security whispered urgently. But Will couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Who was this mysterious child who had accomplished what teams of specialists couldn't? And why did watching them together feel like witnessing a miracle he was about to destroy? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Grace Washington had pressed her face against the cold window of the abandoned 1995 Honda Civic that served as home, watching her mother Sarah inject another needle into her collapsed veins. The car reeked of stale cigarettes and broken dreams, its torn seats held together by duct tape and desperation. Grace clutched a water-damaged calculus textbook she'd rescued from a dumpster behind Charlotte University, its pages yellow and brittle but still readable. "Baby girl, your mind is your freedom," her grandmother Martha had whispered during those final COVID weeks, her nurse's uniform hanging loose on her shrinking frame. "They can take everything else, but they can't touch what's in here." She'd tapped Grace's forehead with a trembling finger before the ventilator silenced her forever. Now, 2 years after Martha's death, Grace survived by collecting aluminum cans and sharing a single daily meal with her unconscious mother. She'd memorized the locations of every public library in Charlotte, timing her visits between security rounds to study advanced mathematics by flickering fluorescent lights. Her clothes came from church donation boxes, her shoes from whatever fit among abandoned belongings. 3 miles across town in the pristine neighborhoods of Myers Park, Isabella Montgomery sat at a mahogany desk worth more than Grace's entire existence, tears streaming down her face as another expensive tutor packed up in frustration. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery," the Harvard graduate said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Bella simply doesn't have the cognitive capacity for advanced mathematics. Perhaps we should consider adjusting her academic expectations." Will Montgomery stood in his marble-floored study, watching his daughter's shoulders shake with quiet sobs. 3 years had passed since breast cancer had stolen his wife Rebecca, leaving him to navigate single parenthood while building Technova into a $2.8 billion empire. He'd hired the best tutors money could buy, enrolled Bella in Hillcrest Academy where tuition cost more than most families' annual income, yet his daughter seemed to shrink further into herself with each passing month. In the adjoining sitting room, 78-year-old Eleanor Montgomery folded her arthritic hands and watched her son pace like a caged animal. She'd moved in after Rebecca's funeral, recognizing that grief had transformed her successful son into an emotionally distant stranger. Nora had spent 40 years teaching public school children, watching young minds bloom when nurtured with patience and love. But Will's approach to his daughter's struggles mirrored his business strategy: throw money at problems until they disappeared. "Will, honey," Nora called softly. "Come sit with me." He paused his pacing, his jaw tight with frustration. "Mother, I don't have time for—" "That child needs her father, not another employee." Nora's voice carried the authority of decades spent managing unruly classrooms. Bella's not broken. She's grieving. There's a difference. But Will had already turned back to his laptop, fingers flying across keys as he scheduled interviews with more expensive specialists. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the wind, carrying whispers of change that neither family could yet imagine. The September morning that changed everything began like countless others for Grace Washington. She woke to the sound of her mother's labored breathing in the back seat, Sarah's face gray and waxy from another night chasing chemical oblivion. Grace carefully stepped over broken glass and discarded needles, her bare feet finding safe purchase on the cracked asphalt of the abandoned parking lot behind Whole Foods. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger as she approached the dumpster, lifting the heavy lid to search for yesterday's discarded meals. The manager, a kind-hearted woman named Rosa, sometimes left day-old sandwiches wrapped in clean paper towels near the top. Today Grace found half a turkey club and a bruised apple, a feast by her standards. She ate the apple immediately, saving the sandwich for her mother when Sarah eventually surfaced from her drug-induced stupor. Grace had learned to ration hope the same way she rationed food, in small, carefully measured portions that might last until the next opportunity arose. The walk to Piedmont Park took 45 minutes, but Grace cherished every step. She'd discovered the route 3 weeks ago while seeking shelter at the public library, and something about the ancient oak trees called to her spirit. Her grandmother Martha had loved trees, claiming they held the wisdom of generations in their rings and the patience of eternity in their branches. Grace settled into her usual spot beneath the largest oak, pulling out her water-damaged textbook and a pencil stub worn down to barely 2 inches. She was working through advanced calculus problems when she heard frustrated crying from a nearby bench. A girl about her own age sat hunched over an expensive-looking backpack, designer clothes marking her as someone from a different world entirely. The girl's blonde hair was perfectly styled, her uniform crisp and clean, yet tears streamed down her face as she stared at a mathematics worksheet with the desperation of someone drowning in numbers. Grace recognized the problems immediately. Algebraic functions that should have been manageable for someone with proper instruction. She watched the girl erase the same equation for the 4th time, her frustration building with each failed attempt. "Excuse me, miss," Grace said softly, approaching with the caution of someone accustomed to rejection, "but you're making this harder than it needs to be." The girl looked up with red-rimmed eyes, taking in Grace's torn dress and bare feet. "I'm sorry, what?" "The equation you're working on," Grace continued, her voice gaining confidence as she focused on the familiar territory of mathematics. "You're trying to solve for x, but you're treating it like it's hiding from you. Numbers don't lie or play games. They just are." Isabella Montgomery stared at this strange girl who spoke with the assurance of someone far older. "You know algebra?" Grace smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she'd felt in weeks. "I know mathematics the way some people know music. My grandmother taught me that numbers are just another language for describing the truth of things." She sat beside Bella on the bench, careful not to touch the expensive bag or leave any dirt on the clean uniform. Using a fallen leaf as a visual aid, Grace began explaining the concept of variables in terms Bella had never heard from her expensive tutors. "See, X isn't mysterious," Grace said, pointing to the leaf's veins. "It's just a placeholder for something you haven't discovered yet, like how this leaf doesn't know what color it'll turn in autumn, but the potential is already there, waiting." For the first time in months, Bella felt the fog of confusion lifting from her mind. The numbers began forming patterns instead of obstacles, relationships instead of random symbols scattered across the page. "You're really smart," Bella whispered, almost afraid to voice the observation. Grace's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "My grandmother always said that intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and being patient enough to find the truth. They worked together for an hour under the oak tree's shade, Grace explaining concepts with metaphors drawn from nature, while Bella absorbed the lessons with hungry eagerness. When Bella finally solved the problem that had frustrated her all morning, both girls grinned with shared triumph. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Bella asked as she packed her supplies. Grace nodded, though she couldn't promise her mother wouldn't force another midnight relocation. "I come here most days around this time." As Bella walked away, Grace touched the rough bark of the oak tree and whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her. "Thank you for letting me help someone today. Maybe there's still purpose in this broken world after all." Neither girl knew they had just planted the seeds of a friendship that would challenge everything their families believed about class, race, and the true meaning of education. 4 weeks into their secret friendship, the ancient oak had become Grace and Bella's sacred classroom. Grace arrived each morning with lessons crafted from whatever nature provided: acorns for counting, leaves for geometric proofs, shadows for understanding angles. Her makeshift teaching materials cost nothing but revealed mathematical concepts with startling clarity. Bella's transformation was undeniable. The girl who had sobbed over basic algebra now tackled calculus derivatives with growing confidence. More importantly, her smile had returned, something Will Montgomery noticed during their increasingly rare dinner conversations, though he attributed the change to expensive therapy rather than mysterious park meetings. "Daddy, did you know that the Fibonacci sequence appears in pinecone spirals?" Bella asked one evening, her eyes bright with newfound wonder. Will looked up from his laptop, surprised by his daughter's enthusiasm for mathematics. "That's very interesting, sweetheart. Is Dr. Harrison teaching you about nature in your sessions?" Bella's face clouded slightly. "No, I just learned it somewhere." The lie sat uncomfortably between them, but Bella had become expert at protecting her friendship with Grace. She understood instinctively that her father's world operated on different principles than the generous spirit she'd discovered under the oak tree. Meanwhile, Grace's own circumstances were deteriorating. Her mother, Sarah's addiction had worsened, leading to increasingly erratic behavior and dangerous encounters with drug dealers who showed no patience for unpaid debts. 3 times in the past month, Grace had been forced to find new sleeping locations when their temporary shelters were discovered by police or hostile property owners. "Miss Bella," Grace said during one particularly difficult morning, her voice hoarse from sleeping in the cold, "I might not be able to meet tomorrow. My mama, she's not feeling well." Bella noticed the careful euphemism but also saw the exhaustion etched in Grace's young face. "Grace, are you hungry? I brought extra sandwiches today." The offer of food was presented with such casual kindness that Grace felt tears threaten. In her world, sharing meant going without, yet Bella gave freely without expectation of return. "You're too good to me, Miss Bella. I don't deserve such friendship." "Don't say that," Bella replied firmly, unconsciously echoing her grandmother Nora's teaching philosophy. "Everyone deserves friendship. My mama used to say that love isn't like a pie where everyone gets smaller pieces. It's like a candle lighting another candle. The flame just spreads." Grace absorbed this wisdom with the hunger of someone starved for affection. Her grandmother Martha had spoken similarly about love's multiplication rather than division, and hearing such sentiments from Bella created a bridge between her past and present. Their academic sessions were becoming deeper conversations about life, loss, and dreams. Grace spoke carefully about her grandmother's death, how Martha had worked as a private nurse for wealthy families before the pandemic took her. Bella shared her own grief about her mother's illness, the way cancer had stolen not just Rebecca, but also transformed her father into a distant stranger. "Sometimes I think Daddy blames himself for not saving Mama," Bella confided, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. He throws money at everything now, like buying enough things will keep the rest of us safe. Grace nodded with understanding beyond her years. Grief makes people do strange things. My mama started using drugs after Grandma died. She says it's the only way to stop the hurting, but I think it just makes the hurt dig deeper. These conversations were interrupted one afternoon by the appearance of a well-dressed woman with calculating eyes. Victoria Sterling had been conducting surveillance of the park for 3 days, gathering intelligence about the vagrant influence affecting her star students' behavior. Victoria approached with the predatory smile of someone accustomed to intimidating children. "Excuse me, girls. Bella, your father is concerned about your whereabouts during lunch periods." Grace immediately began gathering her few possessions, recognizing the threat in Victoria's tone. "I should go, Miss Bella." "Wait," Bella said, catching Grace's arm. "Miss Sterling, this is my friend Grace. She's been helping me with mathematics." Victoria's smile sharpened as she studied Grace's appearance, the patched dress, the dirty feet, the defensive posture of someone expecting rejection. "I see. And where do you attend school, dear?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Grace lifted her chin with dignity that surprised Victoria. "I'm between schools right now, ma'am, but that doesn't mean I can't share what I know." "Of course not," Victoria replied smoothly, though her eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. She'd found exactly the ammunition she needed to drive a wedge between the Montgomery family and this problematic influence. "Bella, I think your father would be very interested to learn about your new tutoring arrangements." After Victoria left, Grace turned to Bella with resignation written across her features. "This is where it ends, Miss Bella. People like her don't let people like me stay in people like your lives." But Bella grabbed Grace's hands with fierce determination. "No, you're my friend, and friends protect each other. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Grace wanted to believe in Bella's optimism, but her experience had taught her that good things in her life had expiration dates. Still, sitting under their oak tree with her first real friend, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Neither girl noticed the private investigator Will Montgomery had hired photographing them from across the park, documenting evidence that would soon force all their secrets into the harsh light of adult judgment. November arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made Grace's bones ache as she huddled in the Honda's back seat, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. Her mother, Sarah, had been unconscious for 16 hours straight after a particularly dangerous cocktail of street drugs, leaving Grace to monitor her shallow breathing while calculating how many more days they could survive without food or shelter. The mathematics came naturally now. If Sarah didn't wake up soon, Grace would need to call 911, which meant police involvement, which meant foster care, which meant the end of everything that mattered, including Bella. Despite these mounting crises, Grace had maintained their daily meetings under the oak tree, arriving each morning with lessons prepared and a smile carefully constructed to hide her desperation. Bella's academic transformation had become the one bright constant in Grace's collapsing world, and she protected it fiercely. "Grace, you're shivering," Bella observed during their Wednesday session, watching her friend's hands tremble as she worked through calculus problems on the frost-covered ground. "It's 30 degrees out here. Don't you have a coat?" Grace pulled her threadbare sweater tighter, avoiding Bella's concerned gaze. "I'm fine, Miss Bella. Let's focus on these integration problems. You're so close to understanding the fundamental theorem." But Bella wasn't easily distracted anymore. 4 weeks of friendship had taught her to read Grace's careful deflections and recognize the signs of suffering her friend worked so hard to conceal. "You're not fine. And stop calling me Miss Bella like I'm some rich girl you work for. We're friends." The word friends still felt foreign and precious to Grace, like a jewel she was afraid to hold too tightly. "In my world, we show respect through our words." My grandma taught me that courtesy costs nothing but means everything." "Your grandma sounds like she was amazing," Bella said softly. "I wish I could have met her." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "She would have loved you, Miss Bella. She always said that kindness recognizes kindness, no matter what package it comes wrapped in." Their conversation was interrupted by the crunch of expensive shoes on fallen leaves. Will Montgomery approached with his usual entourage of security personnel, his face a mask of controlled authority that barely concealed his inner turmoil. "Bella," he called out, his voice carrying across the park with unmistakable command. "Step away from that girl." Grace immediately began gathering her sparse belongings, muscle memory from countless previous encounters with hostile adults taking over. But Bella remained seated, her young face setting into lines of stubborn determination that reminded Will painfully of his late wife. "Daddy, this is Grace. She's my friend and my teacher." Will's private investigator had provided detailed reports about the homeless girl corrupting his daughter's environment, but seeing Grace in person created cognitive dissonance he wasn't prepared for. The child radiated intelligence and dignity despite her obvious poverty, her posture straight and her eyes clear as she faced his disapproval without flinching. "Young lady," Will addressed Grace directly, "I don't know what game you're playing, but my daughter is not your responsibility." "No, sir," Grace replied quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Miss Bella is her own responsibility. I just help her see that she's smarter than she believes." The simple statement landed with unexpected force. Will had spent months and thousands of dollars trying to restore his daughter's academic confidence, yet this barefoot child claimed to have succeeded where Harvard-educated professionals had failed. "Show me," he demanded, surprising himself with the request. Grace glanced at Bella, who nodded encouragingly. Without fanfare, Grace began explaining advanced calculus concepts using the natural materials around them. Twigs became coordinate axes, acorns represented variables, and fallen leaves demonstrated the geometric relationships between functions and their derivatives. Will watched in stunned silence as his daughter engaged with mathematical concepts that had frustrated her for months, her face animated with understanding and joy. The teaching methods were unconventional but undeniably effective, revealing not just Grace's intelligence, but her intuitive grasp of how children learned. "Where did you learn to teach like this?" Will asked, his hostility beginning to crack. "My grandmother Martha," Grace answered simply. "She said that real teaching isn't about having fancy degrees or expensive materials. It's about seeing the beauty in what you're sharing and helping others see it too." The name Martha hit Will like a physical blow, though he couldn't immediately place why it felt familiar. Martha who? Martha Washington. She was a nurse before she died. Grace's voice carried the quiet grief of someone who had learned to carry loss without letting it destroy her forward momentum. Before Will could respond, Victoria Sterling materialized from behind a nearby tree, her timing suspiciously perfect. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm so glad you've finally seen what I've been trying to tell you. This vagrant has been manipulating your daughter for weeks." Grace flinched at the word vagrant but didn't retreat. "I never asked Miss Bella for anything. Teaching her mathematics makes me happy. That's all." Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course, dear. I'm sure you have no interest in the Montgomery family's wealth or connections. Just a coincidence that you targeted the daughter of one of Charlotte's most prominent citizens." "I didn't target anyone," Grace said, her voice gaining strength from righteous indignation. "I was sitting under this tree reading my book when Miss Bella needed help with her homework. I offered to help because that's what my grandmother taught me to do. Help others when you can." Will found himself caught between competing narratives. Victoria's version painted Grace as a calculating manipulator exploiting his daughter's vulnerability, while the evidence before his eyes suggested something far more complex and potentially miraculous. "Daddy," Bella interjected, her voice thick with tears, "Grace saved me. I was failing everything before she helped me understand that I'm not stupid. She never asked for money or presents. She just cared about me learning." The word saved reverberated through Will's consciousness. How many times had he felt like he was failing to save his daughter from the grief that had consumed their family since Rebecca's death? How many expensive solutions had he purchased without achieving what this homeless child accomplished through simple human connection? "Mr. Montgomery," Victoria pressed, sensing his wavering resolve, "surely you understand the liability issues. The school board would be very concerned about unauthorized individuals influencing students. There are protocols, proper channels." "I understand that my daughter is happier than she's been in months," Will said slowly, his business instincts warring with paternal feelings he'd buried under layers of professional achievement. "And I understand that happens to coincide with meeting this young lady." Victoria's mask slipped slightly, revealing something calculating and cold beneath her professional concern. "Children can be easily deceived by novelty, but consider the long-term implications of encouraging such associations." Grace stood up, brushing dirt from her torn dress with quiet dignity. "Mr. Montgomery, I don't want to cause trouble for Miss Bella. If my friendship hurts her somehow, I'll go away." "No!" Bella cried, jumping to her feet and grabbing Grace's hand. "You can't leave me. You're the only person who understands me." Will stared at their joined hands, his daughter's manicured fingers interlaced with Grace's calloused ones, and felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time Bella had fought for anything with such passion? When had she last claimed to feel understood by anyone? "Nobody's going anywhere tonight," he said finally, though uncertainty clouded his voice. "But we need to have serious discussions about appropriate boundaries and safety protocols." Grace nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir. Thank you for not sending me away immediately." As the group began to disperse, Victoria lingered, her eyes following Grace with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The wheels were already turning in her mind, calculating new strategies to eliminate the threat this child represented to her carefully constructed plans. Neither Grace nor Bella noticed Victoria's predatory attention, but Will caught the expression and filed it away for future consideration. Something about Victoria Sterling's investment in his daughter's academic struggles felt disproportionate and personally motivated in ways that had nothing to do with educational policy. The evening air carried the scent of approaching winter and the promise of changes that none of them could yet imagine. The confrontation Will had been dreading arrived with the piercing ring of his cell phone at 6:47 a.m. on a gray December morning. Victoria Sterling's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting months to deliver devastating news. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm afraid we have a serious situation regarding your daughter's safety. The homeless individual she's been associating with has been arrested." Will's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about?" "Grace Washington was picked up by Child Protective Services last night after a drug raid at her location. Her mother overdosed and is currently in intensive care. The child has been placed in emergency foster custody, pending investigation into her living conditions and associations." The words hit Will like physical blows. Despite his reservations about Grace's influence on Bella, he'd come to respect the girl's intelligence and dignity. The thought of her trapped in the system's machinery while her mother fought for life in a hospital bed stirred unexpected anguish in his chest. "Where is she now?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "That's confidential information, Mr. Montgomery. I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you that this inappropriate relationship has been resolved through proper channels." Bella can now focus on age-appropriate friendships with her actual peers. Something cold and calculating in Victoria's tone set off alarm bells in Will's mind. You seem remarkably well informed about a situation that supposedly just happened. I maintain close relationships with various social services departments. Child welfare is everyone's responsibility, particularly when vulnerable students might be at risk. After ending the call, Will sat in his study staring at the family photograph on his desk. Himself, Rebecca, and 4-year-old Bella laughing on a beach that seemed to exist in another lifetime. Rebecca had always possessed an uncanny ability to read people's true motivations, a skill Will had never developed despite his business success. "What would you do, Becca?" he whispered to the photograph. "How do I know who to trust?" His answer came in the form of his daughter's scream echoing from upstairs. Will raced to Bella's room, finding her sobbing hysterically while Nora tried unsuccessfully to provide comfort. "She's gone, Daddy. Grace is gone, and they won't tell me where." Bella's words tumbled out between gasping breaths. "I called the park and she wasn't there. I went to all our places and she's just gone." Nora's eyes met Will's over Bella's head, and he saw his own growing suspicions reflected in his mother's concerned expression. "How did she find out?" he asked quietly. "Victoria Sterling called here 20 minutes ago," Nora replied, her voice carrying decades of experience dealing with manipulative administrators. "Claimed she was being helpful by informing Bella directly rather than letting her wonder why Grace didn't show up today." Will felt rage building in his chest. Whatever Victoria's true motivations, deliberately traumatizing his daughter crossed every line of professional and human decency. Bella looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes that held an accusation he'd been dreading. "You knew, didn't you? You knew they were going to take her away." "Bella, You let them!" she screamed, her young voice cracking with betrayal. "Grace was the only person who made me feel smart and happy, and you let them take her away because she's poor." The words struck Will with devastating accuracy. He had allowed his fears and prejudices to override his daughter's happiness, convincing himself he was protecting her while actually enabling forces that were destroying the first genuine connection she'd made since her mother's death. "Where is she now?" Bella demanded, her tears replaced by a determination that reminded Will painfully of Rebecca during their early courtship when she'd refused to accept his excuses for emotional distance. "I don't know," Will admitted, the helplessness foreign and nauseating. "But I'll find out." Over the next 3 days, Will deployed every resource at his disposal to locate Grace Washington. His private investigators discovered she'd been placed in a group home 40 miles away in Gastonia, a facility known for housing difficult cases that other placements wouldn't accept. The reports they brought back were troubling: overcrowding, understaffing, and a philosophy focused more on compliance than nurturing. Meanwhile, Bella's condition deteriorated rapidly. She refused to eat, couldn't sleep, and her academic performance collapsed completely. The confident, engaged child who had emerged during her friendship with Grace vanished, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who moved through their mansion like she was haunting it. "She's grieving another loss," Nora observed during one of their evening vigils outside Bella's locked bedroom door. "First her mother, now her dearest friend. How much abandonment do you think one child can survive?" Will pressed his palms against his eyes, feeling the weight of decisions that seemed to multiply his family's suffering rather than healing it. "I was trying to protect her." From what? From intelligence? From kindness? From the first real joy she's experienced since Rebecca died. Nora's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had watched too many children suffer at the hands of well-meaning but misguided adults. "Will, that girl saved our Bella, and we've repaid her by allowing the system to swallow her whole." The turning point came when Will's head of security delivered a report that changed everything. Grace had attempted to run away from the group home twice in the past week, both times being found at bus stops trying to make her way back to Charlotte. When questioned about her destinations, she'd given the same answer each time. "I need to check on Miss Bella. She needs me." "Sir," the security chief added quietly, "there's something else. The girl's mother died this morning. Overdose complications. Grace doesn't know yet." Will felt something break open in his chest. While he'd been wrestling with abstract questions of appropriateness and social boundaries, Grace had become a complete orphan, alone in a system that viewed her as a problem to be managed rather than a child to be cherished. That evening, he found Bella in Rebecca's old garden, sitting among the dormant rose bushes with Grace's water-damaged calculus textbook in her lap. She looked up at him with eyes that held a heartbreak too profound for her 11 years. "I know why you sent her away," Bella said quietly. "You were scared of what people would think about us being friends with someone poor and black. You were scared it would hurt your business or your reputation." "Bella, that's not—" "It is, Daddy." Her voice carried the terrible clarity of childhood's capacity for truth. "And you know what's funny? Grace never cared that we were rich. She never asked for anything except to help me learn. She loved me for who I am, not what I have. And I loved her the same way." Bella closed the textbook and stood, her small figure somehow commanding in the gathering dusk. "Mama used to say that love isn't about what's comfortable or convenient. It's about choosing each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." As his daughter walked back toward the house, Will realized he faced a choice that would define not just their family's future, but his own character. He could continue hiding behind social expectations and business considerations, or he could honor the values Rebecca had tried to instill in their daughter. Values that Grace Washington had somehow kept alive when his own faith had faltered. The next morning, Will Montgomery made a phone call that would shock everyone who knew him. But for the first time since his wife's death, he felt like he was moving toward something meaningful rather than running away from the responsibilities that mattered most. The call Will had dreaded came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, piercing through the fragile sleep he'd managed to find after another day of watching his daughter waste away. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Hayes from Charlotte Memorial Hospital, her tone carrying the practiced gentleness of someone accustomed to delivering devastating news. "Mr. Montgomery, this is about your daughter, Isabella. She's been brought to our emergency department following a suicide attempt." The words hit Will like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending his world tilting off its axis. He was already reaching for his clothes before Dr. Hayes finished explaining how Bella had swallowed a bottle of her late mother's anxiety medication, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I want to be with Mama and Grace. Nobody needs me here anymore." Will arrived at the hospital to find Nora already in the waiting room, her face aged a decade in the space of hours. She looked up at him with eyes that held 40 years of accumulated disappointment in his choices. "They pumped her stomach," Nora said quietly. "She'll live, but Will, that child wanted to die. Your 11-year-old daughter saw death as preferable to the life we've been giving her." The psychiatric evaluation revealed what Will had been too blind to see. Bella's depression had been masked by her brief happiness during the friendship with Grace. Without that connection, she'd spiraled into a darkness that made ending her pain seem like the only logical solution. "She keeps asking for Grace," Dr. Hayes explained during their consultation. "She believes that her friend is dead or has forgotten about her." The trauma of sudden abandonment, combined with unresolved grief over her mother's death, has created a perfect storm of hopelessness. Will sat in the sterile hospital room watching his daughter sleep. machines monitoring her vital signs, while emotional devastation that couldn't be measured by medical equipment ravaged her young heart. When she finally opened her eyes and saw him there, her first words weren't an apology or explanation. "Is Grace dead too?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the stomach-pumping procedure. "No, sweetheart. Grace is alive. She's in foster care." Bella's eyes filled with tears that seemed too large for her small face. "I thought maybe if I died I could find Mama and tell her about Grace. Tell her that I found someone who loved me the way she did." The words shattered what remained of Will's emotional defenses. He'd been so focused on protecting his daughter from potential exploitation that he'd failed to recognize the genuine love that had flowered between two children who needed each other desperately. Meanwhile, 40 miles away in Gastonia, Grace Washington sat in the corner of an overcrowded room at Sunrise Group Home, clutching a photograph of her grandmother Martha that had somehow survived all their relocations and losses. She'd just been informed of her mother's death by a social worker who delivered the news with bureaucratic efficiency before moving on to discuss placement options. Grace hadn't cried. Tears seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford when survival required every ounce of emotional energy. Instead, she'd retreated into the mathematical certainty that had always provided comfort, calculating probabilities, working through equations that had predictable solutions unlike the chaos of human relationships. "Washington," called Mrs. Bradley, the facility supervisor. "You have a visitor." Grace looked up in confusion. She'd been at Sunrise for 2 weeks without a single visitor, having no living relatives and no friends who knew her location. She followed Mrs. Bradley to the visiting room, expecting perhaps a lawyer or another social worker with more forms to sign. Instead, she found Will Montgomery sitting at a plastic table, looking haggard and older than she remembered. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes held a grief that mirrored her own. "Hello, Grace," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Grace remained standing, her posture defensive despite her curiosity. "Thank you, sir. How did you find me?" "I hired investigators. It took longer than it should have." Will gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit. We need to talk about Bella." Grace's carefully constructed composure cracked at hearing her friend's name. "Is Miss Bella okay? Is she sick?" "Did something happen? She tried to kill herself 3 days ago because she thought you were dead and that nobody loved her anymore." The words hit Grace like a physical assault. She sank into the plastic chair, her hands trembling as she processed the information. She what?" "She swallowed a bottle of pills. She left a note saying she wanted to be with you and her mother." Will's voice broke slightly. "Grace, my daughter is dying without you. Not from disease or accident, but from heartbreak, from the belief that the person who made her feel valuable and loved has disappeared from her life forever." Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, horrified by the unintended consequences of their separation. "I tried to come back. I tried to get to the park to see her, but they kept bringing me back here. I didn't know how to contact her, how to tell her I was okay." "I know," Will said, reaching across the table to cover her small hands with his own. "And I'm ashamed that it took my daughter nearly dying for me to understand what I'd allowed to happen to both of you." Grace looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 12 years. "You were scared of what people would think, about Miss Bella being friends with someone like me." Will nodded, accepting the judgment he deserved. "I was scared, yes, but not just of what people would think. I was scared of being responsible for another person's well-being when I'd already failed so completely at taking care of my own family." "You didn't fail Miss Bella, Mr. Montgomery. You just forgot that love isn't about keeping people safe from everything. Sometimes it's about taking risks because the other person is worth it." The simple truth delivered without accusation or bitterness, completed Will's transformation. This child, who had lost everything and everyone she'd ever loved, still possessed the grace to offer forgiveness and wisdom to the man who had enabled her suffering. "Grace," Will said, his voice steady with newfound conviction, "I came here to ask if you'd consider coming home with me. Not as charity, not as a project, but as family. Bella needs you, and I think I need you too. To remember what it means to love someone more than you fear the consequences." Grace stared at him, afraid to hope for something so impossible it felt like a mathematical error in the universe's calculations. But looking into Will's eyes, she saw the same desperate love for Bella that had sustained her through weeks of separation and loss. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of answered prayers and second chances. "I want to go home." The revelation that shattered Will Montgomery's understanding of everything began with a photograph tucked inside Rebecca's jewelry box. He'd been gathering her belongings for donation when his fingers found the small frame wedged behind velvet compartments, its existence forgotten during 3 years of grief-stricken avoidance. The black and white image showed a younger Rebecca in a hospital gown, radiant despite her obvious exhaustion, holding newborn Bella. Standing beside the bed was a black woman in scrubs, her gentle smile familiar in ways that made Will's chest tighten with recognition he couldn't quite place. On the back, Rebecca's careful handwriting read, "Martha Washington, our angel. Without her, neither Bella nor I would be here." Will never knew how close we came to losing everything that day. Will's hands began to tremble as fragmented memories assembled themselves into devastating clarity. The night of Bella's birth had been a blur of complications, hemorrhaging, emergency procedures, his own helpless terror in waiting rooms while Rebecca's life hung in balance. He'd been so focused on his own fear that he'd barely registered the nursing staff who had literally saved his family. Martha Washington, Grace's grandmother. The woman whose skill and dedication had preserved everything Will held dear, now deceased from a pandemic that had claimed so many essential workers, while people like him worked safely from home offices. His private investigator's report lay on the desk, confirming details that made Will's stomach churn with shame. Martha had worked double shifts at Charlotte Memorial throughout COVID-19, refusing safer assignments because the maternity ward needed experienced nurses. She'd died alone in isolation, her granddaughter prevented from saying goodbye by quarantine protocols that protected families like the Montgomerys while sacrificing families like the Washingtons. "Jesus Christ," Will whispered, the profanity feeling inadequate for the magnitude of his moral failure. Grace wasn't just some random homeless child who had befriended his daughter. She was the granddaughter of the woman who had saved his family, orphaned by circumstances he could have prevented if he'd shown even minimal interest in the people who served his family. The investigation revealed more devastating truths. Martha had applied for assistance programs during her final illness. Programs funded by grants from Montgomery Family Foundations. The applications had been denied due to technicalities and bureaucratic delays that could have been resolved with a single phone call from Will's office. Grace and her mother had become homeless just weeks after Martha's death, evicted from their apartment when Sarah's grief-induced addiction made employment impossible. They'd lived in their car for 18 months while Will's company donated millions to various charities, none of which reached the people who had actually sacrificed for his family's well-being. "Daddy?" Bella's voice startled him from his horrified contemplation. She stood in the doorway of his study, pale and fragile from her hospital stay, but determined to be part of whatever was keeping him from bringing Grace home. "Sweetheart, you should be resting. I can't rest while Grace is still locked up somewhere thinking I've forgotten her." Bella approached his desk, her eyes falling on the photograph. "Who is that with Mama?" Will's voice was barely audible. That's Martha Washington, Grace's grandmother. She saved your mother's life when you were born. Bella studied the image with growing wonder. Grace's grandma saved Mama, and we didn't even know. I didn't know. Or rather, I didn't bother to remember the people who mattered when it counted. Will's confession carried the weight of recognition that would change him permanently. Bella, Grace isn't just your friend. Her family saved ours, and we repaid that debt by allowing the system to destroy what remained of hers. Before Bella could respond, Nora appeared in the doorway with Victoria Sterling behind her, the principal's presence immediately filling the room with tension. Will, we need to discuss the situation with this Washington child before you make any impulsive decisions, Victoria said, her tone carrying assumed authority over his family's choices. Victoria, I don't recall inviting you into my home or asking for your opinion about my family's decisions. Victoria's smile was sharp and calculating. Given the circumstances, I felt it important to provide context you might be lacking. The Washington family has a history of exploiting wealthy families' guilt and generosity. Exploiting? Will's voice carried dangerous undertones that made Nora step protectively closer to Bella. Martha Washington was notorious for insinuating herself into patients' lives, creating emotional dependencies that led to inappropriate financial requests. She did the same thing with your family, didn't she? Made herself indispensable during a vulnerable time, then leveraged that connection for personal gain. The accusation hung in the air like poison, but Will's response surprised everyone in the room, including himself. You're absolutely right, Victoria. Martha Washington did exploit my family. She exploited our crisis by working overtime without additional compensation to save my wife's life. She exploited our wealth by never asking for anything in return for preserving everything I hold dear. She exploited our privilege by dying of a disease she caught serving families like mine, while her own granddaughter became homeless because I was too self-absorbed to remember the people who made my happiness possible. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Will, you're being emotional. Think about the precedent this sets, the liability issues. I'm thinking about the 11-year-old girl who tried to kill herself because we separated her from the only person who made her feel loved since her mother died. I'm thinking about the 12-year-old orphan living in state custody while I live in a house that exists because her grandmother saved my family. You can't possibly be considering adoption. The background checks alone would reveal. Would reveal what, Victoria? That Grace is brilliant, kind and loyal to people who matter to her? That she's survived unimaginable hardships while maintaining her dignity and compassion? That she taught my daughter mathematics and self-worth when teams of expensive professionals failed? Victoria's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Will. These people, they're not like us. They don't value the things we value. Martha Washington was a manipulative woman who used her position to insert herself into families where she didn't belong. The venom in Victoria's voice revealed truths she hadn't intended to share. Will studied her face, recognition dawning slowly. You knew Martha personally, didn't you, Victoria? This isn't about educational policy or child safety. This is personal. Victoria's composure crumbled entirely. Martha was my sister, my brilliant, saintly sister who chose to throw her life away serving ungrateful people instead of taking care of her own family. She could have used her nursing degree to build something lasting, but instead she martyred herself for strangers who forgot her name the moment they left the hospital. The revelation hit the room like an explosion. Bella gasped. Nora stepped back in shock, and Will felt pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly forming a clear picture. You've been punishing Grace for Martha's choices, Will said quietly. Destroying an innocent child because you resent your sister's service to others. That child is exactly like Martha, too smart for her own good, too willing to sacrifice herself for people who will ultimately abandon her. I was trying to teach both of you a lesson about the real world before you made promises you wouldn't keep. Victoria's confession revealed the depth of her psychological damage, but it also illuminated the path forward with crystalline clarity. Will looked at his daughter, seeing Rebecca's moral courage reflected in Bella's young face, and knew exactly what his next words needed to be. "Victoria, you're fired. Security will escort you from the premises, and if you attempt to contact my family again, I'll pursue every legal remedy available. Your twisted vendetta against a child ends now." As Victoria was removed from his home, Will turned to face his daughter and mother, both of whom were staring at him with expressions he hadn't seen since Rebecca's death, pride mixed with hope. "Bella, we're going to bring Grace home today, and then we're going to spend the rest of our lives making sure she knows she belongs with us." For the first time in months, Bella smiled with genuine joy. "Promise, Daddy?" "Promise, sweetheart. Some debts can only be repaid with love, and we owe Grace's family more love than I ever imagined." The reunion took place not in the sterile environment of a government office, but under the ancient oak tree in Piedmont Park, where two girls had first discovered that friendship could transcend every boundary society tried to impose between them. Will had insisted on this location, understanding that some moments required the blessing of sacred spaces where love had already taken root. Grace arrived in the back seat of a state social worker's sedan, her few possessions contained in a plastic garbage bag that seemed to mock the dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. She'd grown thinner during her weeks in foster care, her eyes holding shadows that spoke of institutional neglect and the soul-deep exhaustion of a child who had learned not to hope too hard for good things. Bella waited beside the massive trunk, her own recovery evident in the way she stood straighter, her face animated with anticipation rather than the hollow despair that had nearly claimed her life. When she saw Grace emerge from the car, she didn't run or shout. Instead, she simply opened her arms and waited, giving her friend the choice to bridge the distance between them. Grace approached slowly, as if walking through a dream that might shatter at any moment. When the girls finally embraced, both began crying. Not the dramatic sobs of movie reunions, but the quiet tears of people who had survived separation and found each other again. "I thought you'd forgotten me," Grace whispered against Bella's shoulder. "Never," Bella replied fiercely. "I could never forget you. You're my sister." The word sister hung in the autumn air with the weight of chosen family, bonds that transcended genetics or legal definitions to touch something eternal about human connection. Will watched from a respectful distance, allowing the girls their moment while paperwork and practicalities waited for love to finish its work. The legal proceedings that followed were surprisingly swift, facilitated by Will's resources and the undeniable evidence that Grace belonged with people who cherished her rather than institutions that merely managed her. The judge, a black woman in her 60s who had herself navigated the foster system decades earlier, looked over the adoption papers with careful attention to detail. "Mr. Montgomery," Judge Patricia Williams said during the final hearing, "I've reviewed the reports from Grace's caseworkers, her academic records, and the psychological evaluations of both children. What I see is a young woman who has demonstrated remarkable resilience and intelligence despite circumstances that would have broken many adults." She turned to Grace, who sat between Will and Bella in the front row of the courtroom. "Miss Washington, you understand that adoption means this becomes your legal family. You'll have the same rights and responsibilities as any biological child?" Grace nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am." But I also understand that family means more than legal papers. Family means people who choose to love each other no matter what. Judge Williams smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd shown during the proceedings. That's the wisest definition of family I've heard in 23 years on this bench. Mr. Montgomery, I'm approving this adoption with one condition. Will tensed, preparing for some bureaucratic obstacle he'd failed to anticipate. I want Grace to keep the Washington name as part of her legal identity. Martha Washington sacrificed too much to have her memory erased by paperwork. From today forward, she'll be Grace Washington Montgomery, honoring both the grandmother who raised her and the family that's chosen to continue that legacy. The name rolled off Judge Williams's tongue like a benediction, acknowledging past and present while pointing toward a future where Grace's origins would be celebrated rather than hidden. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she realized she wouldn't have to choose between honoring her grandmother's memory and embracing her new family's love. The first weeks of Grace's integration into the Montgomery household revealed challenges no amount of money or good intentions could instantly resolve. She woke screaming from nightmares about abandonment, hoarded food in her dresser drawers, and flinched when adults approached too quickly. The trauma of loss and institutional neglect had carved deep wounds that would require patience and professional help to heal. But there were moments of pure joy that reminded everyone why they'd fought so hard to become a family. Grace's laughter echoing through halls that had been silent too long. Her patient tutoring sessions with Bella evolving into collaborative study periods where both girls pushed each other toward academic excellence. The sight of Grace and Nora baking cookies together, flour dusting their hands as they shared stories about Martha's favorite recipes. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Nora told Grace one afternoon as they pulled chocolate chip cookies from the oven. "She raised you to be generous and brilliant and kind, even when the world gave you every reason to become hard and bitter." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her floury hand. "I miss her every day, Mrs. Nora. But being here, being loved like this, I think I understand now what she meant when she said that love doesn't die. It just finds new ways to grow." The transformation was mutual. Will discovered that success measured in stock prices and quarterly reports paled beside the satisfaction of watching Grace's confidence bloom under steady love and encouragement. He enrolled her in advanced mathematics programs, hired tutors to help her catch up in subjects where institutional neglect had left gaps, and most importantly, learned to listen when she shared memories of Martha or fears about the future. 6 months after the adoption was finalized, Will established the Martha Washington Educational Foundation, endowing it with $50 million specifically dedicated to supporting foster children and the children of essential workers. The foundation's first scholarship recipients included 12-year-old Grace Washington Montgomery, who would attend the prestigious Davidson Academy on full scholarship while living at home with her chosen family. The announcement ceremony took place fittingly under the oak tree in Piedmont Park. Local news crews captured the moment when Grace, now healthy and radiant in her school uniform, stood beside Will to cut the ribbon on a bronze plaque honoring her grandmother's service. Martha Washington taught her granddaughter that intelligence and kindness were the most valuable gifts anyone could possess. Grace read from prepared remarks, her voice steady and clear. "Today, we're promising that other children won't have to choose between honoring their families and building their futures. They can do both." As the ceremony concluded and reporters dispersed, the Montgomery family lingered under the oak's protective canopy. Bella and Grace sat on either side of Nora on a bench Will had installed as a permanent memorial to the friendship that had saved them all. "What are you thinking about?" Will asked Grace as she stared up through the branches toward a sky filled with infinite possibility. "I'm thinking about mathematics, Mr. Will." about how love multiplies instead of dividing, just like Grandma Martha always said. Grace smiled with the wisdom of someone who had learned that the most important equations couldn't be solved on paper. And I'm thinking that this is what home feels like. Dear friends, this story reminds us that the most profound moments in life often come disguised as ordinary encounters. How many times have we walked past someone who needed exactly what we had to offer? How often have our own children or grandchildren surprised us with wisdom that humbled our assumptions about age and experience? Grace and Bella's friendship under that oak tree teaches us that love recognizes no boundaries of race, class, or circumstance. At our stage of life, we've learned that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the connections we forge and the lives we touch. We've buried friends, raised families, and accumulated enough life experience to recognize authentic love when we see it. Will Montgomery's journey from prejudice to acceptance mirrors our own evolution, the moments when we've had to choose between what's comfortable and what's right. Martha Washington's legacy reminds us that every act of service, every moment of kindness ripples forward in ways we may never fully understand. The question isn't whether we have enough time left to make a difference, but whether we're brave enough to recognize the Grace Washingtons in our own communities and respond with open hearts. What moment in your life taught you that love transcends social boundaries? Have you ever discovered that someone you initially dismissed actually had something precious to teach you? Share your stories below. Your experiences might inspire someone else to see with clearer eyes.